Don't you guys hate it when you're building a deck and you want to splash a color? Maybe you're a dual colored deck and you just need a little bit of a third color to get yourself an identity. You're a monocolored deck, but you wanna just have a little bit extra layer in there. Mono white doesn't quite just do it for you. And you've got these like little empty spaces left over, like this one, which is a mono white deck, but colorful ensemble is a really cool piece, and it's a dream team piece. So I need to have green and red in it. But how do I make it so that way I can get Mel Invisible, which is a very good Elrig, to work with this mono white piece? I've got only a couple slots remaining here. This is the core of the deck, but I don't know what to throw in as my last couple cards. This is actually kind of one of the hardest problems in Wecross deck building that you can actually find yourself involved in. So the question is actually a little harder to answer than it first might seem to be. So how does one make it so that way their deck works by splashing colors in? And we're gonna just go over real quick some options that you can do to make these types of problems go away pretty easily. These are basically my shorthand ways to just fix the problem pretty quickly, and then maybe an edit. Maybe when I'm fine tuning things, that's when I'm starting to figure out exactly what I want there. So the first thing to go over here is you've got cards like this that sometimes you're going to consider for the deck itself here, right? And these won't work. There's a problem with every single one of these, and I wanted to point them out. So this is a good thing that if you're thinking I want a dual color deck, right, and you want to support a deck color fully and utterly, right, then you might want to put these in here, and they bring a lot of power to it. This in those cases you're looking for something like I don't know, maybe 10 cards of that color cost in order to make it exist. But there's a really big deck requirement for it, right? So with random drain, the biggest issue is that you've got this requirement that even to use it, at the bare minimum to use it, right, you need to have one blue in contention in order for you to do. And that's going to require you to have anywhere from 8 to 10 cards in your main deck in order to run this. So this isn't really a splash. This is a pretty heavily consideration that you're going into a dual color at this point, if you're going to be doing some kind of spells with a actual casting cost. Because unlike Signy's, spells just sort of, you can't do anything with them until you can cast them. Signy's, you get a little bit away with it a little bit more. I've got Orochimaru here, for example. But Orochimaru here has also a cost, right? Yes, you can just, if you have lots of cards in your hand and you're splashing for just this first effect, it's great, but usually you're splashing it for both of these effects, right? So you're going to need that colorless cost again here. So we're not going to be going over these. These aren't the shortcut methods I use for this, although Orochimaru, in its defense, could be theoretically used a little bit easier. Diabride is also one of the ones that is actually harder to use, but again, potentially could be used. More or less, what this does is this is a bit of filtering that you can get in any color, but then also it has the ability to enter burn the opponent, especially at a very weird timing, by having red cards targeted. Now again, you could theoretically put this into your splash, but the effect of it, right, anytime a red Signy gets targeted, gets worse and worse the less red cards you have in your deck. So a splash usually consists of anywhere from 4 to 6 cards in your deck. It's really not a big amount at all, right? Whereas if you had 10 in your deck, it's 1/4 of your deck. If you have 6 to 4, it's closer to 1/8 of your deck. So it's a much less hard commitment for it. So we're going to talk about those. Now, the first ones that are always come to mind here are multicoloreds. Now, while I still really like multicoloreds, and I think they do the job, I also still like their power of at being at 5,000 at level 1. The level 2 multicoloreds are basically unusable just because you'd rather your level 2s do something a little bit better, and level 2s just in general, there's less slots of them open for your deck. Plus level 2s is where you want to start maybe thinking about life bursts. So these are options, but they've become less powerful over time because innately they don't really give anything to your deck other than being multicolored. Now, there are certain times where you'll use these, right? If you're basically running a mono-white deck that needs mono-white, like, Signy on the field, you might use these to get your splash, for example. But generally speaking, I am starting to look at elsewhere for my splashes for cards that are more powerful. These are more like concessions that I make if I can't even find the things that I can slug in at the most basic level. I also want to give a shout out, an honorary mention to these types of effects here, which are these are the like life burst things that you can slot in if you have the opposite problem here, which is you need to fill in life bursts, but dual colors don't come in life bursts, then you can use these as examples. These are the 3 that I most commonly use in all my deck building for anything. Level 1s that do a free open lane, level 2s that you pay 1 but you basically get rid of anything on the opponent's field, period, and level 2s that allow you to draw 3 cards. These ones end up being the most rewarding in any deck as a splash. You don't often see them, but I usually max out about 2 of these effects in any deck because I'm trying to stay away from vanillas nowadays. It's just I would rather have cards with effects to them and do things. But honorable mention goes to these. These can be a very good way to fill out the last couple slots. Normally I have about 4 slots that I've already got filled out, and these are filling out maybe the last 2 slots. Jumping right into white here. Basically, these are the ones that I think are the easiest to splash in. Generally speaking, if you're splashing a color, you want your splashes to be level 3s if you can help it, because they allow you to have a little bit more flexibility in deck building, right? You'll get your what do you call it? You'll get your enter by these getting vanished, the level 1s first, and the level 1s will be on color for you, so you'll have them on the time that you need, and then the splash colors, you can enter them easily because they're level 3s and you don't need them right away in the early game, or you can you'll have them later in the game, they'll get vanished, and then they'll be in your enter zone for you. These are the top 3 that I would use. I think these are the most splashable, and any deck can really benefit from having these. Exias just give you unparalleled defense. Remembers give you unparalleled late game offense, as well as a little bit of defense as well, very mid-rangey. And Yukis are just phenomenal utility. There's at no point in time a Yuki is all that bad to put on the field. Whether you're screwing things being in the wrong lane, whether you're moving things around to be in a better position for you, or whether you're vanillaing out, the Remember, for example, on the side of the field so you can do things. There are some decks that, for example, the Adams deck that I was splashing white specifically just for Yuki, because it gets you out of a lot of messes. So as far as white goes, these are the top 3 cards I would consider to put into my deck if I wanted to splash white, and also the cards that would be pushing me to splash white. If, for example, in that Adams deck, which functions very, very well as as a black and blue mid-range deck, but it just constantly dies to Remember on the opponent's side of the field, well, then Yuki is a really easy solve, and you might do that. Likewise, I've had decks where I just get run over by aggro, and just by merely adding 4 Exias into the deck, I suddenly now have a 50-50% against aggro. That was helping me a lot in my GP testing, for example. You might get into a situation where you're thinking, well, what should I put in there as white assists in order to get me there? And a common one here, too, by the way, that isn't on here is MC Lion. And the reason I didn't put MC Lion is the worst of the different colored 3 stops that you can be playing. Generally speaking, I think that these are better options than MC Lion currently, but MC Lion certainly is a fine option, being a 3 stop, and we have more 3 stops on the list, so you can just compare it to there. In all of these slides, I did one slide where I'm doing a paid option and one slide where I'm doing a completely non-paid option. This way you can give yourself freedom of being like, I'm splashing for 4 Exias and that's it here, because I just need that, so I need access to my white. Therefore, I'm going to use Yuki Yuka Pawn and Yuki Yuka Dojan to get me there, right? Whereas Akino has a option to pay for it with that white cost, but generally speaking, you're only ever using that about 20% of the time. So it's also a freer option to do it, but it is it's a good option. Like, it's just an all-rounder option that you won't get punished for, and you can use that white with only 4 to 6 color of that Signy in your deck, or those spells in your deck. So 4 or 6 colored cards will get you there with Akino as well, which is why I like it as like a very non-committal splash. White has an issue where it is a little difficult to splash it. The reason being is there's so many good white cards that you might want to pack in it that it's better as a dual color, in which case you might upgrade some of these Elrigs to something else. It also is that it has sort of weaker Elrigs that require no commitment to them. Dojan, for example, has the requirement of you kind of want to be in a discard deck or an Enderburn deck for it to really feel its function. But white has that issue, which makes it a weird sort of support color, but the card pool is so rich but sometimes you just force it anyways, and it's very good for you. Kind of on the opposite end of that spectrum here, we've got red. So these are the cards that I picked for Red's best splash cards that you could choose. We've got Ramel, we've got Lancelot. These are sort of known commodities, right? If you need more damage output in your deck, specifically early game damage output, then Ramel and Lancelot have you covered. Ramel has been in better shape than it's ever been, in the fact that it can get rid of 3,000 or less, and there's just a ton of 3,000 cards walking around nowadays. And if you'll notice, both of them have the colorless cost for their effects, meaning they can just eat, red cards if they're chilling in your enter zone and you don't need them, or they can just eat your main color if you needed that as well. This makes them fantastic splash stuff. I think they've been basically future-proof since set 1 over here, because they are just incredible, incredible cards that get underplayed, to be honest with you. The last card that I picked for a splash card is Carnival, which I also think is criminally underplayed. So Carnival has a once per turn ability where you can basically just copy a card that's on the field, right? It doesn't even have to be a Signy on your field. It can be a Signy on the opponent's field too. And basically everyone's making such high power plays all the time. Carnival kind of is never bad. I mean, it's never fantastic either, right? If you have an H2O, but you don't have, you want an H2O, but you don't have an H2O on your field, well, Carnival's not going to save you in that scenario, but it can mimic things and become really good. There are some times where, like, for example, you have a Phalaris and you need a second Phalaris, but running a second Phalaris in your deck would be kind of crazy. So instead, Carnival's a good choice, because you can become that second Carnival, or you can become that second Phalaris and be like, look, you're milling out one way or another. You can choose to vanish one of these, but it's not going to make any difference, right? And Carnival can do that kind of stuff. You don't really need red. I know there's a red cost on there. It's got a coin cost on there. That's generally speaking not what you'd use Carnival for. And I think all three of these cards are pretty good. What makes red a little awkward in the support role, right, as a splash, is outside of these cards, it's really hard to find stuff that makes your red deck any better. You have some stuff, but mostly all that stuff, like Diabride, for example, says, target red Signy on it, so you end up having it a little bit harder to work with. Red kind of likes being the main color of the deck rather than the assist color. This also kind of gets complicated by the assist package that you can run as well. So I picked here 2 assist packages that I think are pretty fantastic. We got Rill Flash, and yes, if you want to use some coins, you can use the other Rill. That's perfectly acceptable too, as well as Rill Drawn Sword. Rill Drawn Sword is one of the few Elrigs in the field. They can play defensive, but also vanish to Signy for a pretty low cost over time. And this makes it a pretty good one. And since it's once per game, you can use that red when you have it. It doesn't mean that you need to use it right away. So you are more free to use this Rill than you'd think so. I think this Rill is a pretty good way to splash red into your deck. Likewise, I also really like the X line. So there's X Gazer here, which just vanishes Signy, right? There's also X Echo, which is really good, but it requires you to run at least 10 to 12 red cards in your deck, so it's not really a splash anymore at that point. And there's X Crossfire, which gives you access to Enterburn, specifically not Enterburn that can be Xenoclustered. And it also gives you a really cheap way to attack during attack phase, vanish during attack phase. So I like these two quite a bit as to a way to splash red without actually needing to spend very much to splash red whatsoever in terms of like the enter costs. Generally speaking, like I said, red's not necessarily the most supportive color right now as it is, but if you were looking for a reason to get early damage, and that is a very legit reason to be like, I should be thinking about adding red to my deck, this is a great way to do it. Moving right along to blue. Blue is one of the most supportive colors that you can use in your deck. Blue is a great supportive color. There's in fact so good that it was hard to choose down which exact blue cards I was thinking would be the best to bring in here. Hakat definitely takes the cake in terms of being just the best filtering that you can possibly do. Hakat's like, you can run that as, and I have run this in a deck where I just wanted some filtering, right? Especially green decks, for example, where it basically been green and another color, and then Hakat just to filter. And it has worked great for me. Hakat is unparalleled at that. But there's also 2 other Signy that do that. They're going to get an honorable mention here. It's going to be Sui, which also allows you to draw 2 cards and discard 2 cards. And then there is also Umir, which allows you to filter the first top card of your deck. You look at it, you can put it on the top or bottom, and then you can toss Umir into the bottom of your deck, and then play the top of your deck immediately, which means it digs too deep, and it also does something Hakat does not do, which is do it immediately, and it has a life burst. So blue, just by virtue of putting a blue Elrig in your deck, you can get unparalleled filtering for your deck. So if you're like just saying my deck lacks consistency and I need some amount of consistency, blue is really, really good to bring in. Blue's discard package is now also so tight that you can pretty easily add a discard package to any deck. So take, for example, your mono red deck. By splashing Bruno and Monomin into it, and maybe, I don't know, Random Drain if you have it, or something along those lines, you end up being in this really, really consistent world where just between the two of them, you can kind of pressure the opponent's hand. Maybe not enough to completely discard them out like the hard discard decks do, but between these two and Scalia as well being also an honorable mention as a discard outlet, you can go ahead and really pressure your opponent's hand while simultaneously pressuring their enter or damaging them, which makes for a pretty good tempo backing. But again, I've seen white red aggro decks splash some of these just to get themselves a little bit sort of like multi-resource denial. And here are the best cards to splash if you're going to go ahead and use these Elrigs to bring in some of these blue cards. Madoka Float and Madoka Clap is always a really good option to just basically stop damage and also filter really, really well. But I think there needs to be a special shout out to Tamago. Tamago Beating, by the way, which puts a card on the bottom of your deck, bottom of the opponent's deck, and Tamago Double Roll, which is a draw 2 card, as well as Tamago Jet Stick on its level 2, which just downs something for free, and then you can pay any color enter you want and draw 2 cards. There's a lot to be said for these. I guess a special shout out to Ray as well, because Ray can basically draw you 3 cards and make the opponent discard 3 cards if you're looking for something like that in your aggro deck. Tamago can basically get shoved into any aggro, mid-range, or tempo deck that lightly wants to touch blue and just enable it for you really, really easily without actually having to commit hard to blue. I've even seen certain decks do something like Tamago and Ray just in a tempo deck, and they're actually mostly a red deck just to gain access to stuff like Summer Lives Blues. So Tamago is really one of the best possible ways to add blue to your deck without actually having to add very much any commitment to the color costs whatsoever. So you could, for example, run Tamago and then just run Hakat, and you have suddenly your deck's not going to filter is going to filter really well, and also not going to fold to discard very easily. So it might be a cool way to counter that in maybe a dual build that you're running. Running down to green, I think people underestimate how splashable green is nowadays. Green is very good as a support color, but it has a very specific function that it needs to do in order for you to want to splash it, which is you're kind of enter hungry, right? If you're enter hungry or you actually don't use very much enter and need enter sinks, green is a really good card pool to bring into your deck. So between Bet and Sheeran, right? I've had decks with 3 Sheeran and 3 Bang, and I've had some of those games end up with me having basically more enter that I could ever hope to use, and basically being impervious to enter burn. This is a really, really good concept to bring in. Now, Bang is a little difficult because you need to basically be not running other cards that discard cards, right? There's Ogana now that discards cards to kill things. There's also Monomin, which discards things to make your opponents discard. But if you're not running any discard outlets, Bang actually becomes a very incredible card to use, because there's nothing better than converting the cards that your opponent is trying to get rid of in your hand to just a resource for yourself, and be like, no, I'm just going to convert the cards that you normally use to discard, and I'm just going to convert them to enter. The discard cards are now going to rot in your hand, and they're just going to be kind of useless for you, and I'm still going to have access to do the things that I need to do. It also allows you to, for example, skip your enter step and keep cards in your hand and then play those cards instead, so you don't have to hold them just to be discarded on your next turn. Speaking of discard, Contempora is fantastic here. Contempora basically, it makes itself impervious to mill or discard, mostly discard for your opponent. You need to go ahead and have enter available, but again, you're splashing green, so that's not super difficult because you got Sheeran to bring in and Bang to bring in for these types of things. And it also gives you a really cool out to aggro by having all Signy on your field gain level 1 and level 2 level 2 Shadow, you basically just make it immune to almost everything. It has Shadow level 1 and Shadow level 2, which means that it also does stop Elrigs, but for the most part, it's during your opponent's turn. So this is really, really nice in the fact that it makes it so that way you can be kind of immune to a lot of aggro or mid-range damage output. Aside from bringing the cards back to your hand by paying an enter and making yourself more or less immune to enter to discard, this is a very, very good card to put in. Plus, its life burst is very nice, and you need level 3s with life burst on it. So I like it in all forms if you're going to want this. So again, your idea is if you're going to bring in green to your deck, it's probably because you're just a little enter hungry, and you need a little bit more mileage in your tank, for example. Here are some of the best Elrigs that you can possibly bring in for splashing. I like Mel Revise and Mel Invisible. I like Mel Revise specifically because it does what I said you need with green, which is if you're looking for enter, it gives you enter to work with, and then it also kind of gives you the green if you need to be picky for that splash. So you can use the Mel Invisible, the 3-stop following that. Ought is a really good choice as well for your if you're basically trying to do this non-committal splash. It gets you the enter that again I think is necessary for these types of decks, but it follows it up with being able to negate attacks for a very cheap rate. Right, 1 enter to stop 1 attack, 3 enter to stop 2 attacks, and that's pretty on par for basically stopping damage. I think these two together is actually a very underappreciated way to get green into your deck and really start abusing the fact that you just are going to get more enter out of it and have more resources to work with in general. Lastly, we're going to be talking about black and some of the things that black can splash. Now, there was multiple options here. I'm going to give a special shout out to specifically Bernices. Bernices has been underwhelming for me. Its life burst has been better than its actual effect has been, with its actual effect being that sometimes it's a 7,000, but also can mill your opponent too. That card is fine. It needs sort of a dedicated control shell to be really pretty good. So if you're splashing black in your control decks, or your sort of like slow mid-range decks, Bernices is a really good shout out. But these ones you can basically put into any of your decks and add black to it very, very easily. Anna Mirage comes off at the top end. It kind of circumvents the whole spell problem I was talking about here by being a Signy that you can always upgrade any Signy that you've got with it. But it's colorless to use its effect, which makes it even better, and it has a fantastic life burst. So it ends up being one of those cards where just basically if I'm running black in my deck and I'm not like I have a fine amount of enter, I just put 2 Anna Mirage into the deck pretty much always. With your 4 spells that you're running maybe in a different anything else, like you can run 2 Anna Mirage pretty free all the time, and it will never really affect your deck. Likewise, Phalaris ends up being good in any deck that's got any number of basically recursion, and there's a lot of ways to have recursion with your black Elrigs, so it just ends up supporting the same sort of like reason you're bringing black in, right? If you're bringing black in, it's because you need late game damage. Phalaris can offer that by having mill damage. It also allows you to get a lot of trash filtering, and Phalaris is one of those things that you'd rather have in your trash and pull out than just use at some point. So Phalaris gets a nod here. You run one of if you've got a pretty dedicated recursion package. If you don't, then you end up running 2 basically, and you are pretty good at that point to find it whenever you need with just a normal amount of draw. Nanashi has, however, a different role, which is basically it's a colorless way to give negative 3,000s and open up the opponent's field. When it attacks, it basically chooses 2 Signy and gives it negative 3,000. It can grow as the games go on, which is kind of nice. Black will always, generally speaking, have some way to do a level 3 remove something on the opponent's field and not actually cost any amount of black. Modem was the way to do it sort of prior to Nanashi. Now there's Nanashi. Coming up in the next set, we're going to get ourselves a new Signy called Mew Memoria, which also does it, just basically discards cards in your hands to do it. So these all end up being a great way to open up a lane. So you'll always find a level 3 Elrig that opens up lanes really easily for sort of quote-unquote free in black. Now, how does one splash black into your deck? Well, there's basically two different ways to do it. The primary method is add Machina. Machina is such a good assist line on its own. It's got a million different ways that you can do it. It's got a 3-stop. It's got a Machina Smash, which is a 1-stop plus utility. It also actually has a colorless way too in the Machina Refresh, where you can add the or repair, excuse me, where you can add a card from your trash and put it into your life cloth, which I think is less impressive, but has its uses. And so basically 90% of the time you should be using Machina to add black to your deck without really any black requirement or very minimal black requirement. The other way that you can do it is with Nanashi. Nanashi allows you to basically have unparalleled card filtering in your late game by using Nanashi's ability to bring things back from the trash. You also get some amount of ways to open up lanes in this. Nanashi is a good way to basically take any mid-range deck and just make it a little bit more consistent. I say mid-range decks, it usually has to use white in order to have Signy that block off lanes on your opponent's turns to make up for the fact that that Nanashi is very, very, very not defensive. Now, I wanted to also take this as a moment to talk about Nanashi. I see it used a lot, probably a lot more than it should be. At the GP, Nanashi was one of the most popular assist lines to be used. I think it clocked in about 10%, maybe even 8% of decks used Nanashi. And generally speaking, aside from the one deck that top 8'd, most of them were in the bottom half of the standings. And a lot of that has to do with Nanashi being, one, a pretty hard Elrig to use correctly, and two, it actually doesn't fit most decks archetypes. So it's not a super, super free way to bring it in, unlike Tamago, which is sort of just like you add it and it's free. I would mostly stick to the Machina assist line if needed. Now, in the next set, there's going to be a very, very good assist line that's basically free to add for black. And that is going to be the Urith assist line, which mills the opponent, basically opens up lanes and mills the opponent 8 throughout its assist line. This is also a really good way to do it, but it's mostly used in aggro decks. I wouldn't necessarily use it in other decks as freely. But so if you're looking for a way to splash black in your aggro deck, but like not really dedicate yourself to black, then the Urith assist line is going to be a pretty good way to do it. Generally speaking, this is going to be your reasons for bringing things in. So if, again, just in recap, if you're looking for more defense and a little bit more utility, maybe some card filtering, you're going to want to bring white into your deck as a splash. If you're looking for early game damage output, because your deck needs a bit more of a clock, and specifically it has a clock maybe already in the late game, it needs an early game clock, bring in red. Red will be a great way to bring that in. If you're looking for more deck consistency, as well as maybe a couple ways to mess with the opponent's resources, not a complete way to mess with it, right? Not the discard that your Sing Control decks do. Then blue is a really great option to do. Again, I can't express enough how easy it is to take your deck and just make it more consistent by adding blue and using blue's filtering options. If you find yourself being like very tight on Enter, but you have a lot of splashy effects that you don't want to cut, which ends up being a lot of sort of like decks that are more untuned, but want to still play those splashy effects but are having a hard time to do so. By adding green to your deck, you get a lot more support than I think most people give green credit for. And if you're looking for a way to late game add a clock to your deck because your deck is just dirtling around too much, maybe it's just not moving forward at a pace that you need it to be. A lot of white or blue decks, for example, fall into this scenario. Adding black is a great way to do that, as well as it'll let you toolbox your trash a little bit. It won't give you as great as filtering as like as blue gives you, or the immediate filtering that you might get from white. But if you're looking for just a little bit extra filtering, black will get you there. So these are the reasons why you'd want to splash these specific colors into your decks, and how best to do so with a very small amount of deck footprint to build with.